Hi everybody, my name is Corey, and the topic of my research paper I wrote for the semester was the gender wage gap. This is supposed to be the fun parts of my paper, so I'll try not to make it too long and I will try not to bore you too much. But it should follow the PowerPoint pretty closely if you want to open that up and just listen along while you look at the slides. Just some background information. The definition of the gender wage gap is just the differences in wages that occur between men and women that are in basically the same position, just so we're all on the same page for what that means. In the United States, the gender wage gap currently stands at 21 cents. So for every dollar that a man makes, a woman makes 79 cents, which I personally find a little bit ridiculous, and that's why I was so interested in this topic. And a lot of people believe that the gender wage gap is actually a myth, so here I am today to prove these people wrong, because that is just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Just the focus of my paper, there are three main parts to it. The first is a review of the gender wage gap that occurs between subspecialties of surgery, and I'll get to that in a little bit as to why I chose that topic. And then the second part is a summary of the explanations given from the literature that explain the wage gap between men and women in the physicians area specifically. And the third, I decided to do a review of just why the gender wage gap occurs in all fields, just in general. So the first part of my paper, gender wage gap that occurs in subspecialties of surgery. And I had to kind of narrow down the scope of my paper just because of the actual volume of the information on this topic, because it's been going on for so long, so there's just a lot of research in this area. I found 4 different articles about subspecialties of surgery, and they are cardiothoracics, otolaryngology, plastic surgery, and colorectal surgeons. I just thought it was really interesting to see that in every single field I found there was a pretty substantial gender wage gap that occurred. And you'd think in something so specific like that that requires so much training already, their wages would be pretty much the same, but that's not how it is. There's a lot of statistics on this slide if you look at the PowerPoint, but I'll just mention one here that 78% of men in cardiothoracic surgery make over $350,000, but 60% of women make between $150,000 and $250,000. I just think that's a little bit ridiculous that the majority of men you see are in the top wage bracket while the women are in that middle ground. A possible explanation that was in a lot of the articles I gave, which I thought was really interesting, it stayed pretty consistent throughout, but the specialized human capital hypothesis, and the definition of that is, based in terms of the gender wage gap, is that women's work more commonly requires less training and it's not as highly skilled as men's work, whatever that means. But I didn't really find, it's hard to say what actually caused this, and I did a little bit of research on that too. And one of the possible explanations I found was this article published from Japan, and it was about sex-type job descriptions. And that basically looked at kind of the employer behavior side of this gender wage gap problem that we're having. And Japan has a very similar gender wage gap issue as the same as the United States does. But basically what this paper found was that employers were kind of writing the ads to exclude women and kind of encourage them to take the less skilled jobs and the ones that required less training, and they didn't make as much money. It didn't really give a good explanation as to why this is happening, because it's hard to say how women, quote, choose these jobs. It could be one has better benefits for their children, and they're just more worried about that than men are. But a lot of these papers said the exact same thing. It was hard to actually narrow down why it was happening, just because there's so many things that go into why you choose a job. And I went into that a lot more in depth in my paper, but it's just hard to talk about all of them in this short little video. A little bit about closing the gap. One interesting article, this was probably my favorite article I found, was about mathematics skill and how that affects the gender wage gap. It found that in highly skilled positions, things like chemists and engineers and scientists, things like that, the gender wage gap was only 8%, which is interesting. That's much smaller than the average, which was 17 or 21%, if you're going to look at it that way. And then in blue-collar jobs, the gender wage gap was between 15 and 18%. And something is to be said about this article, whether or not it's completely accurate, because the average we already talked about was 21 cents, but here they're showing even the blue-collar jobs at 15 to 18, which is a little low, or I guess small in these terms. So in conclusion, I hope I proved to you today that the gender wage gap actually does exist. This is just a major topic of conversation that we're having, just because I don't understand why men and women have different wages when they're in the exact same position. I just think that's crazy that we live in these times and that's still happening. But I hope that in the future we don't have to worry about this, because I certainly don't want to be making less than a man that's doing my same job. But I hope you learned something today, and I hope I didn't bore you too much, but thank you for watching.